Hey there, Mike with Financeable here. Today we're going to take a look at net working capital. This topic is a tricky one because it seems simple on the surface, but it's actually pretty complicated once you get in the weeds. I'm going to help you get past that by giving you first the technical, but then a more practical explanation of what net working capital is in the first place. I'm going to walk through a few examples, and then finally give you a framework that I have used with many candidates in banking, private equity, and hedge funds who have successfully landed jobs over the course of my career. By the way, if you find these videos helpful, definitely hit the like button down below and subscribe. We have a lot more videos coming. Let's hop in here. So let's start at the start here. First, what is net working capital? Well, there are kind of two answers to this question at a very high level. There's the technical answer that you would get in an accounting class, and we kind of have to start there because that is the true definition of net working capital. And that definition is current assets excluding cash minus current liabilities. And if I were in an interview, this is where I would start. The thing is, once you get into the weeds of working capital questions and the concepts, this isn't enough. What you really need to understand is the underlying idea behind working capital. And to frame that, we're going to think about this like a business owner. So if you were to ask a business owner what working capital is, they would say something to the effect of, it's the cash tied up in my business. And so working capital is something we generally don't like as a business owner or as an investor. And that's really the more important underlying concept here. Sometimes, by the way, you may be asked, what is the underlying idea? This would be your answer. So in short, both are important. You need the technical definition to answer the question, but the underpinning behind all the complicated versions of questions related to working capital requires you to really get the business owner definition, which is what we'll explore as we go through the video. Let's kick things off by looking at the core accounts within working capital. And we're going to start with current assets. So first, let's define current assets. Current assets are assets that can be converted into cash within 12 months or one operating cycle. And in particular, as it relates to working capital, we're looking at current assets excluding cash. Just to explain why that's the case, cash is cash we can just use regularly today. The analysis of working capital is really a study of tied up cash that we can't access. So we take out the cash that we can access and look at what's really tied up in the business. With that said, let's take a look at the core accounts that we're going to see in current assets. Now I should note that there are other accounts that can show up in current assets, but these are going to be the core accounts that you'll see. And as always with our videos, we're going to look at these in plain English as opposed to super technical terms, just to kind of keep it simple. So let's start with accounts receivable. So accounts receivable is money that's owed to our company from past sales to customers where they haven't paid us in cash. So we've sold the goods, but we haven't received the cash. Inventory, a little more straightforward. This is money that we've invested in goods that we're going to sell in the future to customers. Finally, we have prepaid expenses where we've paid in advance for a service that we have yet to utilize. So these are the three core accounts, and I'd like to make a note about all three of these accounts, which is that they're all uses of dollars at the outset. So when we think about not receiving money or putting money out for inventory or putting money out for a service that we have yet to use, these are all uses of cash when these accounts increase. Now we'll see a little further down the road that it all flips when they decrease, but for right now, I want you to think about these accounts as things that kind of suck up cash. Now that we've covered current assets, let's take a look at current liabilities, which are the other side of working capital. So current liabilities are liabilities that must be paid within 12 months or one operating cycle. And similarly, we're going to look at the most common accounts that occur within current liabilities. So to start with, let's take a look at accounts payable. Accounts payable is money that we owe our suppliers for inventory purchases. So we've purchased goods from a supplier, but they've said, you don't have to pay it all right now, you can pay us later. That's accounts payable. Accrued liabilities are very similar to accounts payable, but this is money owed for anything that's not inventory. So it's really kind of a catch-all for any other item where we have incurred an expense or received a service that we have yet to pay for. So this could be wages, it could be rent, maybe our landlord gives us the ability to pay later on our rent, or something along those lines. But the short story here is accrued liabilities, by the way, also called accrued expenses, those are synonymous terms, are liabilities where we owe money for something where we've received the benefit but have yet to pay. Now, if you look at all three of these, they're actually the flip of what we discussed with current assets. They're actually sources of funding. So with accounts payable, our suppliers are giving us money. With accrued liabilities, our landlord or whoever's providing a service is giving us money in advance. With deferred revenue, our customers are giving us money in advance. So to begin with, I want you to broadly think of these things increasing as sources of funding that offset the uses of funding that we discussed with our current assets. To make this a little bit more tangible, let's look at a simple example here, and we're going to start with some descriptions and then we'll work through some math. We're going to imagine that we open a pizza shop and we're going to work through what each of these accounts will represent for the pizza shop. For accounts receivable, in our example, that's going to be corporate customers who buy pizzas from us but don't pay for 60 days, so we're owed that money. We don't receive the money up front. Inventory, as you'd probably guess, is our pizza dough, our sauce, and so on. We prepay for 6 months of insurance so that we have insurance coverage for the coming 6 months. Accounts payable is going to be funding from our pizza dough and sauce suppliers who say, look, you only have to pay 50% up front. You don't have to pay it all. Just pay me all of the rest of it when you get paid when you sell the pizzas. Then we have accrued liabilities. We're going to imagine that the landlord for the pizza restaurant says you can pay the rent at the end of the year. And finally, the best idea of all, we're going to start pizza subscriptions. So we're going to sell customers subscriptions to buy pizzas over the course of 6 months, and that's going to provide us with some funding for the business. So these are our accounts. Now let's look at these accounts in motion with some numbers behind them. All right, let's walk through the numbers. So for accounts receivable, we're going to imagine that we have $500 of accounts receivable. Again, this is money that is owed to us by our corporate customers who haven't paid us yet. We have inventory, so we have to buy $1,000 worth of dough, sauces, and so on. And then for our insurance policy, we have to pay $250 in advance for the insurance policy. So in total here, as a business owner, we have to come up with $1,750 worth of cash. So again, I want to think about this as a use of cash to start with. We have to come up with those dollars. So what we're going to see next is how our current liabilities can offset this cash funding need. All right, so let's work through the current liabilities. So first we have accounts payable of $500 because our inventory supplier said just pay half up front. And then we have accrued liabilities where we're going to pay the landlord for our rent at the end of the year, so we owe that money in the future. The last one is deferred revenue. So we have been prepaid $500 for pizza subscriptions, so that's dollars in the door to us. So as we can see, in total, our current liabilities actually provide us with funding that offsets our funding needs by a total of $1,250. So we needed $1,750 before, but now we only need $500 because we have these current liabilities. So our net working capital, the net funding need for the business, is $500. The thing to note is this is the net funding use of cash, so we're going to think of this working capital on a net basis as an outflow of cash that we have to put into the business. So we've looked at what happens when we open a single pizza shop. Let's look at what happens when we grow the business and open a second shop. So if we open a second shop, what's going to happen here is we're just going to double our working capital needs. Now, admittedly, as you get bigger, you might get better terms and this might change, but for a second pizza shop, you're probably just going to double your current working capital needs. So we've doubled our current assets, we've doubled the current liabilities that offset those current assets, and we have another net $500 that we have to fund. So the punchline that I want you to walk away with from this section is, for most businesses, as they grow, the working capital needs grow, which is an outflow or a use of cash that they have to fund. To summarize this visually, working capital is just cash that's trapped in a business. So as I add current assets, more cash is trapped in the business. And as I add current liabilities, more cash comes out of the business. I'm funded, so more cash comes out. And that general conceptualization is what's really critical to pin down as you're working through working capital problems. Now, it probably goes without saying, assets and liabilities don't just increase, they can also decrease. So in the next slide, we're going to walk through a holistic framework for thinking about increases and decreases in assets and liabilities. So this next slide is a rule of thumb that you really want to have pinned down as you go into your interviews and have to answer working capital questions. So what I've laid out here is assets and liabilities on one side and increases and decreases in both of those accounts. And we've actually already covered half of this matrix. So as assets increase, they're a use of cash. It's cash in the system. As liabilities increase, though, it's a source of cash. We're getting funding to offset that use of cash. But the flip is also true. So when assets decrease, it's a source of cash. Think like you're selling inventory, so money's coming in the door, or accounts receivable are going down, so you're collecting money. And as liabilities decrease, it's actually cash out the door. So think of this as we're now paying the money that we owe. It's like paying down a loan. So this 2x2 matrix is what you can use to kind of navigate whether or not assets and liabilities are sources and uses of cash for your working capital problems. So now let's apply what we just learned to a big picture example of an entire business as opposed to a single unit. And we're going to look at a business that has $10,000 in revenue, $1,000 in current assets, $500 in current liabilities, and net working capital as a result of $500. So the 1,000 minus the 500. With this information, we can say that net working capital as a percentage of revenue is 5% of the total, and we're going to assume that working capital is proportional to revenue growth as the business grows. Quick side note here. In this example, which is really the typical example in most cases, current assets exceed current liabilities, so we have a positive net working capital business. In a future video, we're going to explore what happens when you have negative working capital, but for now, we're going to tackle the most common version of a working capital problem, which is just positive working capital. So with that said, let's take a look at year 2. So in year 2, we're going to assume that the working capital of the business remains proportional to sales, so it goes in line with sales as sales grow. And we're going to look at the cash impact of our growth in working capital. In year 2, we are going to assume that revenue doubles. It grows from 10,000 to 20,000. And as a result, everything in working capital doubles as well. So our current assets go from 1,000 to 2,000. Going off the framework we learned on the prior slide, if working capital is growing from 1,000 to 2,000, it's an increase in an asset. So that is a use of $1,000. So we now have $1,000 that we need to fund. Current liabilities also double. And so now we have an increase in a liability, which is a source of cash. And so we have $500 to offset that $1,000 of funding needs. So as a result, in total, net working capital increases from 500 to 1,000, which as you'd probably guess, is a net cash need of $500. So the 1,000 that we need for the assets, less the 500 that was generated from the liabilities. So the punchline with this is for positive working capital businesses, as they grow, they tend to need cash or use cash. Now let's look at the reverse scenario, a declining business. We have the same business. We're again going to look at year 2, again going to assume that working capital is proportional to sales, and we're going to look at the cash impact from this decline in the business. So we're going to assume that the business declines by 50% from $10,000 to $5,000 in revenue, and that current assets decrease from $1,000 to $500. Well, if an asset is decreasing, that's a source of cash of $500, so we get $500 in the door. But current liabilities decreases as well, and as a result, we have a $250 cash outflow because a decreasing liability means we have to basically pay back liabilities, so it's cash out the door. On a net basis, working capital goes from 500 to 250. So if working capital goes from 500 to 250, we have a net cash inflow of $250. So in short, the decreasing asset funded money that outweighed the funding cost of our liabilities. So the punchline here is, for a positive working capital business like this one, when it declines, again, all else equal, assuming everything remains proportional, the business will actually generate cash on a downturn. Now, there are clearly a bunch of nuances to this. It isn't nearly as clean and straightforward as this in real life when businesses are declining, but this is the starting point you need to have to answer these questions in interviews. So hopefully, after watching this video, you have a good understanding now of the technical and more practical definitions of working capital, the main accounts that are in working capital, both the current assets and the current liabilities, the impact to cash that increases and decreases in assets and liabilities has, and then finally, the cash impact of a growing or declining positive net working capital business. So as always, thank you so much for taking the time to check out our videos. If you found this video helpful, definitely hit the like button down below and subscribe. We have a lot more videos like this coming. Take care and hope to see you soon.